October 14th, 1958. 2:15 a.m. Attica Correctional Facility, Cell Block D. The air in Attica was a living thing. It was thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and a low, simmering despair that clung to the concrete walls like damp moss. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his eyes tracing the hairline fractures in the gray slab above him. He knew them like a map of a city he could never visit again. In here, power was a different currency. It wasn't about cash flow or territory. It was about the space you could command with a look, the silence you could impose with your presence. For 5 years, Bumpy had commanded his 6 by 9 foot space with the same quiet authority he'd wielded over Harlem. He was a king in a cage, but a king nonetheless. The night shift was always the worst. The daytime guards were institutionalized, bored, their cruelty a function of routine. The night guards were different. They were men who savored the dark, who felt the prison's true, predatory nature stir when the sun went down. Tonight, the air felt different, heavier. The usual symphony of coughs, snores, and muttered nightmares was muted, replaced by a tense, listening silence. The sound of boots, heavy and deliberate, stopped outside his cell. Not the usual shuffling patrol. This was a gathering. Bumpy sat up, his back straight, the thin mattress crinkling beneath him. He didn't reach for a weapon. His mind was the weapon. He cataloged the sounds. The scrape of a key. The heavy thud of the bolt being drawn back. The door groaned open. 8 of them. 8 white guards, their faces pale and taut in the dim corridor light. Officer Miller, a man with a piggish face and hate-filled eyes, stood in the lead. Behind him were 7 others, their expressions ranging from nervous excitement to outright bloodlust. They held no official clubs, no sanctioned tools of enforcement. They held lead pipes wrapped in newspaper, thick wooden dowels, and one man, C. O'Sullivan, slowly slapped a blackjack against his open palm. This wasn't discipline. This was an execution. Problem, gentlemen? Bumpy's voice was calm, a low baritone that absorbed the tension rather than reflecting it. He remained seated on his cot, a posture of deliberate, insulting calm. Miller sneered, stepping into the cell. The others crowded in behind him, filling the tiny space, their bodies radiating a stale heat of sweat and cheap coffee. Big problem, Bumpy. We got a problem with a nigger who still thinks he's a king. We're here to remind you what you are. Bumpy's eyes didn't leave Miller's. I know what I am. A man. Which is more than I can say for a pack of dogs who need 8 sets of legs to corner one cat. The insult landed. Miller's face flushed a deep, ugly red. Get him. The first blow came from the side, a wooden dowel catching Bumpy across the ribs. The crack of bone was sickeningly loud in the small cell. He grunted, doubling over, but his legs were already moving. He drove himself forward, under the swing, and slammed his head into Miller's gut. The guard gasped, stumbling back. For a split second, Bumpy was on his feet, a cornered animal fighting with primal fury. He landed a punch that shattered the nose of a younger guard, a spray of hot blood hitting the wall. But it was 8-1. A lead pipe slammed into the back of his knee, and his leg buckled. He went down. The pack descended. It was a storm of hate. Boots stomped his back. Pipes crushed his hands. The blackjack found his temple, his jaw, his cheekbone, again and again. He tried to curl into a ball, to protect his head and his vitals, but they were relentless. They rolled him over, exposing his front. He could feel his ribs snapping like dry twigs. A steel-toed boot connected with his mouth, and the world became a coppery taste of blood and shattered teeth. He didn't scream. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction. He held on to one thought, a burning coal in the fading embers of his consciousness. Their faces. Miller's pig eyes. Sullivan's sneer. The nervous twitch of the young one he'd hit. The mole on another's neck. He memorized them. He burned their images into his soul. As the world dissolved into a roaring tunnel of black, he heard Miller's voice, panting and thin. That's enough. Drag the trash to the infirmary. Tell him he fell off his bunk. The laughter that followed was the last thing he heard. October 14th, 1958. 7:30 a.m. Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The Gilded Cage Club. The phone rang with the shrill insistence of bad news. Frank Junebug Lucas, Bumpy's most trusted man, was in the back office of the club, counting the previous night's take. The sun was just starting to cut through the Harlem haze, but inside the windowless office, it was perpetually midnight. Junebug was meticulous. He ran Bumpy's empire with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker, because that's what Bumpy demanded, and that's what Junebug's loyalty delivered. He picked up the receiver. Yeah. The voice on the other end was frantic, a low-level associate named Weasel who had a cousin working as a janitor at Attica. June. Oh God, June. It's Bumpy. Junebug's blood went cold. The stacks of cash on the desk suddenly looked like meaningless green paper. Talk to me, Weasel. Slow and clear. My cousin. He called from a payphone. There was a thing last night. In Bumpy's cell. They're saying he's gone, Junebug. They're saying he's dead. The word hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. Dead. It was an impossible word. Bumpy Johnson didn't die. He was a monument, a landmark. Men like Bumpy didn't die from a fall or a shiv in the yard. They were forces of nature. The receiver felt impossibly heavy in Junebug's hand. His knuckles were white. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Who? The question was a rasp, a piece of gravel torn from his throat. Guards, June. A whole crew of them. They went in his cell. My cousin said they dragged him out like a sack of garbage. The word in the prison is they beat him to death. Junebug slammed the phone down. The crack of the Bakelite echoed in the silence. He stood there for a full minute, his mind a white-hot static. This was it. The moment every man in their world feared. The king was dead. The foundation of their entire world had just been pulverized. He stumbled to the small sink in the corner and retched, his body convulsing with a grief so profound it felt like a physical assault. He saw Bumpy's face, not the fearsome kingpin, but the man who'd taken him in as a boy, who'd taught him the difference between being a tough man and a smart one. The man who was more a father to him than his own had ever been. He splashed water on his face, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He looked at his reflection in the small, cracked mirror. The man looking back was terrified. The organization would look to him now. They would see this fear. He had to bury it. He had to become what Bumpy would be in this moment. Cold, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He walked back to the desk, his stride now measured, his face a mask of stone. He picked up the phone and began to make calls. Within 30 minutes, Bumpy's entire inner circle was assembled in the office. Men like Hollywood Harold, Philly Brown, and the quiet, lethal enforcer known only as Whisper. They saw the look on Junebug's face and knew. The grief in the room was a palpable, suffocating force. He's gone, Junebug said, his voice now steady, forged in the fire of his initial shock. The guards at Attica. They murdered him in his cell last night. A low growl went through the room. Whisper, a man who rarely spoke, slammed his fist on the desk, cracking the mahogany. Who? We don't know yet, Junebug said. But we're going to. Just then, the office door burst open. It was Weasel, his face pale, gasping for breath. June, I got another call. My cousin, he was wrong. The first rumor was wrong. Every man froze. Hope was a dangerous, painful thing. He ain't dead, Weasel gasped. But he's close. They got him in the infirmary. They broke him all to pieces, June. They're saying he might not make it through the day, but he's still breathing. The relief that washed over Junebug was so intense, it almost brought him to his knees. It was followed instantly by a rage so pure and so cold it felt like ice water flooding his veins. The false alarm had ripped him open, shown him the abyss. Now, standing on the edge of it, he knew exactly what he had to do. Bumpy was alive, and that meant there was still a king to fight for. All right, Junebug said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet carrying more menace than any shout. Change of plans. This ain't a funeral. It's a hunt. October 14th, 1958. 9 a.m. The Gilded Cage Club. The mission was no longer vengeance for a dead king. It was retribution for a living one. The energy in the room shifted from grief to focused fury. The countdown had begun. They had to get the names, and they had to get them before the prison system buried the incident, transferred the guards, and erased the trail. We need names, Junebug stated, his eyes scanning the faces of the men in the room. He was Bumpy's proxy now, his hand in the outside world. Not rumors, not nicknames. We need their full government names, their addresses, their shift schedules, who they drink with, who they're sleeping with. I want to know what brand of cigarettes they smoke and how they take their coffee. I want to know the names of their children. Everything. The operation unfolded with the brutal efficiency of a military campaign. Harlem became a massive intelligence-gathering network. Junebug was the general, the office his command center. Philly, he commanded, pointing to the sharp-dressing numbers runner. Get down to Albany. You got contacts in the Department of Corrections. Lean on them. Money, threats, whatever it takes. I want the official night shift roster for Cell Block D. I want every incident report filed from that block in the last 48 hours, no matter how minor. Hollywood, he said to the charismatic enforcer. Your job is the unions. The Corrections Officers Union. There's always a disgruntled clerk, a secretary who feels underpaid. Find her, charm her, pay her, promise her the world. We need to cross-reference the official roster with the unofficial talk. Who's been bragging? Who came home with blood on his knuckles? Whisper, Junebug said, his voice softening slightly. You handle Weasel's cousin. We need to get him out of there. Offer his family a new life, somewhere far away from New York. But first, we need everything he saw, every face, every name he might have heard, a description of their shoes, anything. The men dispersed, melting back into the city's arteries. The clock was ticking. Every hour that passed was an hour the state had to orchestrate its cover-up. Junebug stayed in the office, a pot of black coffee his only companion. The phone became an extension of his will. He called in favors from lawyers, from bail bondsmen, from journalists on his payroll. He activated dormant assets, men and women throughout the city who owed Bumpy their loyalty, their livelihood, or their lives. October 15, 1958. 11:20 a.m. A diner in Albany. Philly Brown sat across from a sweating, nervous man named Arthur Finch, a records clerk from the Corrections Department. Finch's eyes darted around the diner. On the table between them was a thick manila envelope. Inside was $5,000 in cash, more money than Finch made in a year. They're already burying it, Finch whispered, his hands trembling as he reached for his water glass. The official report says Johnson instigated a riot, that he attacked Officer Miller and reasonable force was used to subdue him. They're commending Miller. Philly's face remained impassive, but his knuckles were white where he gripped his coffee cup. The roster, Arthur. Finch slid a few stapled sheets of paper across the table. Night shift. D block. 7 names. Miller, Sullivan, Kowalski, Jensen, O'Malley, Ricci, and a rookie named Peters. That's what the paper says. The report mentions 8 officers involved in the restraint, Philly said, his voice cold. Finch started sweating again. Yeah, well, the 8th man, a guy named Henderson, his name isn't on the official deployment sheet. He was covering a shift for someone, came over from C Block. They're leaving him off the report. Plausible deniability, Finch's greed had overcome his fear. He'd brought the unofficial sheet, too, for an extra grand. Philly slid another thick envelope across the table. Pleasure doing business. Arthur. He took the papers, folded them neatly, and placed them in his coat pocket. As he walked out, he knew Arthur Finch's career, and possibly his life, had just been irrevocably shortened. A necessary cost. October 15, 1958. 4 p.m. A bar in Queens. Hollywood Herald, dressed in a suit that cost more than the bartender's car, was laughing with a pretty, dark-haired secretary named Dolores. She worked at the union headquarters. He'd spent the day charming her, telling her stories, making her feel like the most important woman in the world. Now, nursing her second gin and tonic, she was talking. And Tommy Sullivan, what a pig. He comes into the office this morning, bragging to the other guys about tuning up the King of Harlem, said they taught him a lesson. He was showing off his bruised knuckles like it was a trophy. She slurred slightly, leaning into Hollywood's shoulder. Said the rookie, Peters, puked in a trash can afterwards. Can you believe it? The kid didn't have the stomach for it. Hollywood smiled, his eyes glittering. Some men are built different. Baby, he had it. Confirmation. Sullivan, the braggart. Peters, the weak link. The pieces were coming together. October 16, 1958. 10 a.m. Attica Correctional Facility, Visitors Room. Getting eyes on Bumpy was the hardest part. The prison was on lockdown. No visitors. But Bumpy's lawyer, a shrewd, expensive man named Samuel Levine, was not easily deterred. After hours of legal threats, calls to sympathetic judges, and a significant cash payment to the warden himself, Levine was granted 15 minutes with his client. The infirmary was a sterile, white-tiled hell. The smell of antiseptic couldn't mask the underlying stench of sickness and decay. Bumpy was in a private room, a courtesy extended by the warden to keep him isolated. The sight of him made Levine, a man who had seen the worst of humanity, flinch. Bumpy Johnson was broken. His head was wrapped in bandages, one eye swollen completely shut, the other a blood-red slit. His face was a grotesque mask of purple and black bruises. A thick stitch tract ran from his temple to his jaw, a crude railroad track of black thread on swollen skin. His lips were split and fat. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, a tube running from his nose. Both of his arms were in casts, and a thick plaster shell encased his torso. He was propped up on the bed, unable to lie flat because of the shattered ribs. Levine approached the bed slowly. "Ellsworth," he said softly. Bumpy's one good eye flickered open. It focused on Levine's face. Recognition dawned, followed by a flicker of the old, indomitable fire. He tried to speak, but the sound that came out was a wet, gurgling cough. A fleck of blood appeared on his lips. "Don't talk," Levine said, pulling a chair close. "Just listen. Your people are worried. They need to know what happened. They need to know what you want." Bumpy's breathing was labored. He raised his right hand, a monumental effort. The cast was heavy, but his fingers were exposed. Slowly, painfully, he held up 8 fingers. He held them there for a long moment, his eye burning with an intensity that transcended the pain, a cold, clear message from the wreckage of his body. 8. Then, his fingers curled, all except the index finger. He tapped his temple. Then he drew his finger across his own throat. The message was unmistakable. 8 of them. An eye for an eye. For what they did to his head, to his life, they would pay with theirs. Levine felt a chill run down his spine. He was a man of the law, of courts and contracts. This was something else entirely. This was primal. He nodded slowly, a silent compact made in that sterile, white room. "I understand," he said. He stayed for the full 15 minutes, making notes, documenting the injuries for a future lawsuit he knew would go nowhere. But his real job was done. He was the messenger. October 16, 1958, 2:30 p.m., the Gilded Cage Club. Levine walked into the back office, his face grim. Junebug, Philly, and Whisper stood as he entered. They didn't need to ask. The look on the lawyer's face told the story. "It's bad," Levine said, his voice heavy. "Worse than you can imagine. They tried to kill him. Broken ribs, both arms shattered, fractured skull, internal bleeding. It's a miracle he's alive." Junebug's jaw tightened. "Did he say anything?" Levine looked directly at Junebug. He couldn't speak, but he made himself clear. He raised his hand and held up 8 fingers. Then he drew a finger across his throat. Silence. The air crackled. The order had come directly from the throne. Junebug nodded once. "Thank you, Mr. Levine. Your bill will be paid." After the lawyer left, Junebug unfurled the papers Philly had brought from Albany and the notes from Hollywood's source. He laid them on the desk. 8 names. Miller, Sullivan, Kowalski, Jensen, O'Malley, Ricci, Peters, Henderson. He tapped each name. "We have them. Philly, I want full workups. Where they live, what cars they drive, the routes they take home, where their wives shop, where their kids go to school." Philly nodded. "Already on it. We have addresses for 6 of them. Henderson and Peters are proving tricky. They're young, move around a lot." "Find them," Junebug said. "Whisper, you'll assemble the teams. For teams, 2 targets each. I want men from out of town. Professionals. No connection to Harlem. They come in, they do the work, they disappear. No noise, no witnesses. It needs to be clean. Surgical." Whisper simply nodded, his dark eyes understanding the gravity of the task. This was the precipice. Junebug felt the weight of it settle on his shoulders. Bumpy had built an empire, a shadow kingdom with its own laws. And the first law was loyalty. The first law was that an attack on the king was an attack on them all. The American justice system had failed. The prison system had tried to execute their leader. So now, the justice of the street, the justice of Bumpy Johnson, would be delivered. He looked at the names again. These men who were, for all intents and purposes, already dead. They just didn't know it yet. He felt no pity. He felt nothing but a cold, righteous certainty. They had torn down a monument. Now, they would become footnotes in the story of why you never, ever touched Bumpy Johnson. October 17th to 20th, 1958. Various locations, New York State. The next 3 days were a masterclass in covert operations. Bumpy's organization moved with a silent, terrifying purpose. Surveillance teams, composed of men who could blend into any neighborhood, were deployed. They watched the homes of the 8 guards, documenting every movement. They learned that Miller was a bully at home, too, a drunk who screamed at his wife. They learned Sullivan coached his son's little league team, a pillar of his suburban community. They learned the rookie, Peters, lived with his mother and cried in his car after his shifts. They learned Henderson was having an affair with a waitress at a diner near the prison. Each detail was a thread, and Junebug's teams were weaving those threads into a net. The out-of-town crews arrived. Quiet, serious men from Detroit and Philadelphia, professionals who understood the rules of the game. They were given files, each containing a target's name, photo, and routine. They were housed in safe apartments in the Bronx, far from Harlem, their presence unknown to anyone but Junebug and Whisper. October 21st, 1958. 8 p.m. The Gilded Cage Club. Junebug stood before a map of New York State, marked with 8 red pins. Everything was in place. The teams were ready. The targets were scouted. The escape routes were planned. Tonight was the night. Final check, he said to Whisper. Whisper went down the list, his voice a low monotone. Team Alpha, Miller and Kowalski. They drink at the same VFW hall after their shift. They'll be taken from the parking lot. Team Bravo, Sullivan and Jensen. They live 2 blocks apart. They'll be taken from their homes after their families are asleep. Team Charlie, O'Malley and Ricci. Carpoolers. They'll be intercepted on the highway home. Team Delta, Peters and Henderson. The trickiest. Henderson will be at his girlfriend's apartment. Peters will be leaving his mother's house. They'll be handled separately, but simultaneously. The disposal? Junebug asked. As you ordered. Downtown. Wall Street. A message to the men in the tall buildings that our reach is longer than theirs. Junebug took a deep breath. There was no turning back. He thought of Bumpy, lying broken in that infirmary bed. He was Bumpy's fury. He was his justice. Go, he said. October 17th, 1958. 3 a.m. Attica Correctional Facility, Infirmary. In the sterile silence of the infirmary, Bumpy drifted on a sea of pain. Consciousness was a fleeting island he'd wash up on, only to be dragged back under by the tide of morphine and trauma. He existed in a fractured world of memory and fever dreams. He was a boy again in Harlem, running numbers, the feel of the pavement hot through the worn soles of his shoes. He saw the face of his wife, Mamie, her expression a mixture of love and perpetual worry. He relived the attack, not as a coherent event, but as a sensory explosion. The grunt of Miller as Bumpy's head hit his stomach, the sharp, clean crack of his own bones, the coppery taste of his own blood filling his mouth, the sound of their laughter. A nurse, a kind, older woman named Eleanor, would come in to check on him. She would change his bandages, adjust his drip, and speak to him in a low, soothing voice, even when she thought he was unconscious. "You're a fighter, Mr. Johnson," she'd whisper, wiping his brow with a cool cloth. "You just hold on." During his brief moments of lucidity, his mind was sharp, a prisoner inside a broken shell. He knew what was happening on the outside. He didn't need a telephone or a messenger. He knew Junebug. He had forged the boy into the man he was, had instilled in him the same unwavering code of loyalty and reciprocity. An attack on the king required a response. Not a riot in the prison yard, not a protest. It required a statement, written in blood, for the entire world to read. He felt no guilt, only a profound, weary certainty. This was the world they had all chosen. Power was a promise, and the promise was protection. When the system that was supposed to protect you became the predator, you had to rely on your own system. He had built his for this very reason. His body was helpless, but his will, his legacy, was at that moment moving silently through the night, an avenging angel with a Harlem address. He worried for Junebug. The boy was smart, careful, but this was a different level. This was an attack on the state. The blowback would be immense. He knew that when the news broke, his own fate would be sealed. They wouldn't kill him now. That would be too obvious. Instead, they would bury him. They would send him so deep into the federal system that the sun would become a distant memory. Alcatraz. Marion. A concrete tomb. He accepted it. It was the price of the crown. He had lived his life by a code, and he would face the consequences of that code. As he drifted back into the morphine haze, his last conscious thought was a prayer. Not for himself, but for Junebug. Be smart, son. Be smart and be safe. October 22nd, 1958. 1 a.m. to 4 a.m. Various locations. The operation was executed with chilling precision. At the VFW hall, Miller and Kowalski stumbled out, drunk and laughing. Two dark sedans boxed their car in. Before they could even register the threat, men in dark coats were on them. A hand over the mouth, a quick, professional pressure on the neck, and they were unconscious, bundled into the trunks of the cars. In a quiet suburban street, Sullivan's front door was opened with a picked gun. Two men slipped inside, silent as ghosts. They were in and out of his bedroom in less than 90 seconds. His wife never even stirred. 2 blocks away, the same scene played out at Jensen's house. On a lonely stretch of highway, a car suddenly pulled in front of O'Malley and Ricci's sedan, forcing them to slam on the brakes. Before they could react, their doors were wrenched open. The rookie, Peters, was the easiest. He was crying when they took him outside his mother's house, a boy in over his head. Henderson was taken from his lover's bed, a look of pure shock on his face. No shots were fired. No alarms were raised. 8 men, plucked from their lives as easily as pulling weeds. October 22nd, 1958. 5:45 a.m. Broad Street, Manhattan. A street sweeper making his early morning rounds was the first to see it. At the foot of the George Washington statue in front of Federal Hall, where the nation's first president had been sworn in, lay 8 bodies. They were arranged in a neat, deliberate row. They were all dressed in their prison guard uniforms. Their hands were bound in front of them with zip ties. There were no bullet wounds, no knife marks. The coroners would later determine the cause of death for each was a single, precise ice pick to the base of the skull, a method favored by assassins because it was quiet, left little blood, and was almost untraceable. Tucked into the breast pocket of Officer Miller, the ringleader, was a single playing card. The King of Spades. The message was clear, unmistakable. You touch the king, you deal with his army. And his army does not lose. November 5th, 1958. Attica Correctional Facility. The news exploded. It was on the front page of every paper in the country. The governor screamed for justice. The FBI was called in. The investigation was massive, a firestorm of raids and interrogations. Harlem was locked down, but they found nothing. The out-of-town crews were long gone. Junebug and the inner circle had airtight alibis. The organization was built on silence and loyalty, and the walls held. They found no witnesses, no evidence, no leads. It was a perfect crime. Bumpy was recovering. He could sit up now, could speak in a low, gravelly voice. He knew what had happened. He saw it in the terrified eyes of the new guards who brought him his food, in the way the warden refused to make eye contact. He was no longer just a prisoner. He was a ghost, a legend whose power extended beyond the prison walls. They came for him on a cold November morning. A cadre of federal marshals, their faces grim and professional. They didn't tell him where he was going. They didn't have to. He was shackled, placed in a heavily armored truck, and driven to a military airfield. From there, a flight to California. Then the ferry across the bay, the cold, salty spray hitting his face. He saw the rock rising out of the mist, a grim, final monument to crime and punishment. Alcatraz. As they marched him up the hill to the main cell house, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had paid his debts. He had upheld his end of the bargain. His body was caged, but his name, his legacy, was free. It was echoing through the streets of Harlem, a warning and a promise. 1959 to 1968. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary and United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners, Springfield. The years bled into one another, a monotonous gray river of time. Bumpy Johnson, inmate #1443, as Z, ceased to be a king and became a number. Life on the rock was a brutal, soul-crushing routine. The cold, the dampness, the silence enforced by the guards. He was isolated, a man deemed too powerful, too influential to be housed with the general population. His only link to the outside world was Mamie. Her letters were his lifeline. They arrived once a month, crisp envelopes filled with her elegant script, a window into a world he could no longer touch. January 12, 1960. My dearest Ellsworth, the winter is cold in Harlem, but our home is warm. Junebug is managing things. He is a good boy, the man you raised him to be. He makes sure I want for nothing. The papers still talk about what happened. They call it the Wall Street Massacre. They have no idea. They speak of it like it was a gangland slaying, but I know it was an act of loyalty, an act of love. I pray for your strength every day. Stay strong, my husband. Come home to me. All my love, Mamie. He would read each letter until the paper grew soft and worn, the ink fading from his constant touch. He wrote back, his letters censored and reviewed by the guards, his words carefully chosen. He spoke of his health, of the books he was reading, philosophy, history, poetry. He was educating himself, sharpening the one part of him they couldn't chain, his mind. June 4, 1963. My dearest Mamie, I have read the Stoics. They speak of a more fatty, a love of one's fate. To accept what is, not as a burden, but as a necessity. My fate was sealed long ago, on the streets of Harlem. This place, this cell, is merely the final invoice for the life I chose. Do not worry for me. My body is here, but my heart is with you on Lenox Avenue. Tell Junebug to be careful. The world is changing. Tell him to be smarter than I was. Yours always, Ellsworth. When Alcatraz closed in 1963, they moved him to Springfield, a prison for the sick and the incorrigible. His body, broken in that Attica cell, was beginning to fail him. The years of pain were catching up, but his spirit remained untouched. He became a sage, a counselor to other inmates. He mediated disputes, offered advice. The legend of Bumpy Johnson was whispered in every federal yard in the country. He was the man who had gone to war with the system and, in his own way, had won. He had sacrificed his freedom for his honor, and in the world he came from, honor was the only currency that truly mattered. 10 years, a decade of his life, traded for 8 of theirs. In the quiet of his cell, late at night, he would sometimes wonder if the price was worth it. Then he would remember the feeling of the lead pipe on his bones, the sound of their laughter, and he knew. There was no other choice. It was the only way. July 12, 1968, 9:15 a.m. Gates of the United States Penitentiary, Marion, Illinois. The final transfer had been to Marion, the new Alcatraz, but the fight was gone from his body. He was 62 years old, but he looked 80. His hair was white, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and scars. He walked with a permanent limp, his hands gnarled with arthritis from the poorly set bones. They were releasing him on compassionate parole. The once feared kingpin was now deemed too old and too sick to be a threat. He stepped out of the prison gates, blinking in the bright summer sun. He wore a cheap, ill-fitting suit provided by the government. For a moment, he felt a wave of dizziness. The world was so big, so loud, so full of color after a decade of gray. A single black car was parked by the side of the road. The back door opened. Junebug stepped out. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man in his prime, his hair flecked with gray, his face harder, etched with the pressures of running an empire. But his eyes, when they fell on Bumpy, were the same, filled with a fierce, unwavering loyalty. He rushed forward, and the two men embraced. Junebug held his mentor, his father figure, and he could feel the frailness of the old man's body. "Welcome home, Bumpy," Junebug whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Bumpy clapped him on the back, a weak but firm gesture. "You did good, son. You did good." The ride to the airport was mostly silent. Bumpy just stared out the window, watching the world go by. The cars were different. The clothes were different. Everything had changed. July 12, 1968, 6:30 p.m. A brownstone on Strivers Row, Harlem. The car pulled up to a beautiful brownstone, a place Bumpy didn't recognize. Junebug helped him out of the car. "Your old place on Lenox, it wasn't secure enough, Bumpy. We got you this," Junebug explained. Bumpy nodded, looking up at the grand facade. But his eyes were fixed on the woman standing in the doorway. Mamie. She was older, her hair styled differently, but she was still the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. She stood there, her hands clasped in front of her, her face a canvas of a decade of love, worry, and waiting. He walked up the steps, each one an effort. He stopped in front of her. They didn't speak. Words were too small for this moment. He reached out a trembling hand and touched her cheek. She leaned into his touch, closing her eyes, a single tear tracing a path down her face. "Ellsworth," she breathed, her voice catching. He looked into her eyes, the eyes that had been his anchor through the long, dark years. He saw his entire life reflected there. The ambition, the violence, the pain, and the unwavering love that had been his only true salvation. "Mamie," he said, his voice raspy from disuse. He pulled her into his arms, holding her with what little strength he had left. He was home. He was no longer a king. His empire was in younger hands. His body was a ruin. But in that moment, standing on the stoop of his new home, holding the love of his life, he had everything that mattered. He had survived. He had paid an impossible price for his code, but his legacy was secure, not in the money or the power, but in the quiet, unbreakable loyalty of the man who called him a mentor and the unwavering love of the woman who now held him and whispered the only name that mattered. "Welcome home, Pop." The voice came from the doorway behind Mamie. A young woman, a teenager now, his daughter Elise. He hadn't seen her since she was a little girl. He looked at her, then back at Mamie, his eyes full. He had traded a decade of his life, but he had come home to his family. The final invoice had been paid in full.